I have executed men before. That is not a confession meant to shock, it is a qualification. Every commissar carries that history the way a guardsman carries scars, quietly, inevitably, with the understanding that such things are not aberrations but expectations. Fear is supposed to be part of it, not fear of the act itself, but fear of doing it wrong. Fear that keeps the hand steady because the soul trembles. Fear that reminds you that judgment is sacred precisely because it costs something. That morning, it cost me nothing. The battlefield was a trench complex reduced to slurry, mud churned into a grey-brown paste by boots, trees, and bodies. Rain fell steadily, cutting thin lines through the smoke and cordite haze. The air tasted metallic, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. Vox units crackled endlessly with partial reports, casualty tallies, requests for reinforcement already denied. Somewhere artillery thundered with bureaucratic regularity, as predictable as a clock. The man knelt in front of me because he had been told to kneel. His rifle lay discarded in the mud, his hands shaking just enough to be noted in the after-action review. His crime was clear, logged by 2 witnesses and corroborated by a junior officer eager to be precise: failure to advance when ordered. Cowardice by definition, punishable by death, without appeal. I remember his eyes, not because they were remarkable, but because they were ordinary. Red-rimmed, exhausted, fixed on the Aquila stamped into my breastplate rather than my face. He smelled of wet cloth, sweat, and fear. I had smelled it 1,000 times before. I raised the bolt pistol. That was when I noticed the weight, or rather, the lack of it. The pistol has always been heavy. Not physically, its mass is negligible compared to the armor I wear daily. Heavy in the way symbols are heavy. Heavy with consequence. Each time I had lifted it before, there was a moment, always brief, always unwelcome, where my chest tightened and my breath caught. Not doubt. Never doubt, but awareness. The knowledge that something irreversible was about to happen, and that I was the mechanism. That sensation did not come. My arm rose smoothly, my grip adjusted automatically. The pistol aligned with the center of his forehead as neatly as a training exercise. I remember thinking, distantly, that my aim had improved. The order was spoken, my own voice calm, formal, reciting the charge and sentence as required. The words sounded correct, proper cadence, approved phrasing. Somewhere behind me, a scribe servitor recorded the audio, its quill scratching rhythmically against parchment, treated with preservative oils. I pulled the trigger. The sound was thunderous at that range, a concussive crack that echoed off the trench walls. The man ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Blood and fragments splattered the mud. Nearby guardsmen flinched, then stilled. Discipline reasserted itself within seconds, and inside me, nothing. No recoil of the spirit, no aftershock, no echo of fear or grim satisfaction or righteous anger. Just a faint, clinical acknowledgement that the action had been completed successfully. The pistol slide cycled. The mechanism locked back into readiness. I lowered the weapon and holstered it with practiced efficiency. I waited, almost idly, for the feeling to arrive late. It did not. That absence disturbed me more than any scream ever had. I stood there longer than necessary, rain soaking into my coat, watching the body slump fully into the mud. The battlefield resumed its rhythm around us. Orders shouted, boots splashing, the wounded dragged back toward aid stations already overwhelmed. No one questioned my pause. A commissar is allowed silence. I reviewed the execution in my mind the way I had been trained to do. Charge valid. Evidence sufficient. Procedure followed. Witnesses present. Record logged. No deviation, no error, and yet something essential had failed to trigger. Fear had always been part of the balance. It kept judgment from becoming casual. It reminded me that I was not an automaton, that the authority I wielded was borrowed, conditional, and terrifying. Fear made the act sacred by ensuring it hurt. This time it was painless. I remember thinking absurdly that it felt like signing a requisition order. Necessary, impersonal, efficient. That thought should have horrified me. Instead, it felt appropriate. As we advanced later that day, I walked the line as I always did, boots sinking into the mire, coat snapping in the wind of nearby detonations. Soldiers straightened as I passed. Some avoided my gaze. Others sought it, desperate for reassurance that someone still embodied certainty. I gave them what they needed, Shells landed close enough to shower us with dirt and shrapnel. I did not flinch. A fragment tore through the sleeve of my coat and nicked my arm. I noted the damage and continued walking. Pain registered faintly, like a distant signal. I realized then that death felt far away, not in the sense of safety. I was no less exposed than before, but in authority. Death no longer felt like a presence watching me, waiting to be appeased through ritual fear. It felt like a statistic, a probability curve, something to be managed rather than respected. That frightened me. Or rather, I understood that it should have frightened me. Instead, I felt a cool clarity settle over my thoughts. Fear had been a restraint, yes, but also a source of friction. It slowed decisions, complicated certainty. Without it, everything seemed simpler, sharper, cleaner. That night, when the guns quieted just enough to allow rest, I lay on my cot in the command dugout and waited for sleep to bring the man's face back to me. Usually it did in some form or another. Faces blur together over time, but they leave impressions, guilt, justification, the weight of memory. Sleep came quickly, dreamless, clean. I woke before dawn to the sound of the artillery resuming its schedule and realized, with a cold certainty, that something fundamental had shifted. Not broken, reassigned. Death no longer held authority over me, and if that was true, then neither did fear. I did not yet understand what that would make me. Only that the Imperium had trained me to function, not to question, when something stopped hurting. The next day, I discovered how quickly men can sense a change in their master's breathing. A commissar does not need to announce certainty. It leaks from posture, from the cadence of orders, from the small pauses between words. The regiment had known me as a blade that cut cleanly, but still remembered the weight of what it severed. They had seen my discipline as righteous precisely because it was measured, because there was always that fraction of a second where my eyes narrowed, where judgment passed through something human before becoming law. That fraction vanished. It began in the ration line. A squad had been assigned forward trench reinforcement duty, digging under fire, hauling sandbags and broken plasteel, laying wire where enemy sightlines were already zeroed in. The kind of work men fear more than a charge, because it feels like dying slowly while pretending it is labor, they muttered, quietly, at first. A complaint about unfair rotation schedules, a suggestion that the lieutenant was incompetent. The words were small, but they grew in the way rot grows given time unchallenged. I heard them from behind, not because I was eavesdropping, but because my senses had sharpened in that strange way that accompanies removal of fear. Every sound felt closer, more distinct, boots scraping, ration tins clinking, the wet cough of a man with lung damage. Their whispers threaded through it all like wire. I turned, 3 men stiffened. One, young eyes sunken, cheeks hollowed by weeks of trench rations, kept talking an instant too long. That instant was his crime. Commissar. The corporal began, voice tightening, trying to turn complaint into explanation. I raised my hand, not in anger, not dramatically, simply to halt speech. The corporal stopped immediately, as if an invisible collar had tightened around his throat. I stepped closer until I could smell the sour fear on them. They stared at my pistol holster the way starving men stare at food. State your designation, I said to the young one. He swallowed. Trooper, he began, then fumbled, because under fear men forget even their own names. His hesitation would once have earned him a warning, a sharp correction, a reminder of discipline. Instead, I felt nothing but a clean impatience, an irritation at inefficiency. Your designation, I repeated, voice flat. He stammered it out. Numbers and letters. A human reduced to a serial code, as the Imperium prefers. I nodded once. You have expressed dissatisfaction with assigned duty, I said, loud enough for those around to hear. You have done so in a manner consistent with undermining morale. His mouth opened. A plea formed. I did not wait for it. The bolt pistol came up so smoothly it felt like it had always lived in my hand. The familiar tightening in my chest did not appear. There was no ritual pause, no internal prayer, just alignment and execution. The shot was deafening in the cramped ration trench. The young trooper collapsed into the mud, helmet rolling loose. Blood spattered the boots of the men behind him. Someone gagged. Someone flinched. No one moved otherwise. I holstered the pistol. Return to duty, I said. They did. Immediately, not because they agreed, but because in that moment they understood something elemental. I would not hesitate. Word traveled faster than Vox. By mid-cycle, squads snapped to attention before I was fully in view. Conversations died the instant my shadow fell across them. Officers, veterans with medals worn dull by grime, watched me with careful eyes, as if trying to determine whether I had become reckless or merely more effective. My orders grew sharper. I found myself issuing commands with a precision that surprised even me. The line needed reinforcement. I reassigned a company without discussion. A lieutenant questioned the redeployment. I reminded him of the chain of command with a single look and a hand resting lightly near my holster. A medici requested additional recovery time for exhausted troops. I denied it in 3 words and signed the refusal with my seal. Everything became simpler when doubt was removed. Mercy, I realized, is often just hesitation dressed up as morality. Fear of making the wrong choice. Fear of being judged. Fear of becoming a monster. Without fear, there was no room for mercy to hide. Executions multiplied, but not in a chaotic way. In an orderly one. Each was documented, witnessed, and filed. I kept the records clean. That was important. If I was becoming something different, the paper trail had to remain immaculate. Every morning, a scribe servitor presented the discipline ledger for my review. The parchment smelled of preservative oil and iron. Names, designations, were listed in neat columns beside offenses, sentences, and the stamps that made death official. My seal pressed into wax beside each completed judgment. The act of stamping became a kind of rhythm. Press, lift, move on. At first, I waited for disgust to bloom, for guilt, for the old fear to return and remind me I was still human. Instead, I felt an odd satisfaction in the cleanliness of it. In the evening, the regiment chaplain approached me. He was a thin man, his face gaunt from fasting and his robes stained with trench mud. Incense clung to him like a second skin. He spoke softly, as priests do when they suspect they are speaking to something already damned. "Commissar," he said, "your zeal is noted." But zeal without reflection. I looked at him. He stopped mid-sentence, throat working. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, whether his rank insulated him, whether his words were worth the risk. He chose caution, as most sensible men do. "Is difficult to bear for the men," he finished lamely. I waited for my old self to respond. The version of me that would have listened, weighed, perhaps even offered a clipped reassurance. Instead, I felt only that clean impatience again. "Bear it," I said. The chaplain swallowed, nodded, and withdrew. His incense trail lingered in the stale air like a fading prayer. That night, I slept without dreams. In the past, screams would echo in my mind after a day heavy with discipline. Faces would return in half-formed nightmares, accusations tangled with my own justification. I would wake with sweat on my skin, heart pounding, and whisper the creed until the shaking stopped. Now, there was only silence. Not peaceful silence, not comforting. A sterile silence, like an empty office after the clerks have gone. It felt clean enough to be unsettling. I began to notice how the men looked at me. They had always feared commissars. Fear is part of the design, but this was different. This was not fear of punishment alone. It was fear of absence, the sense that the man behind the uniform might no longer be present, that only the function remained. They obeyed faster. They did not bargain. They did not plead. They did not even try to explain. Orders were followed with a speed that made the regiment appear more disciplined than it had any right to be in such conditions. Officers looked relieved and sickened in equal measure, as if grateful for the efficiency but uneasy at the cost. I felt no pride in it. Pride requires self-reflection, a sense of accomplishment. What I felt was closer to alignment, like machinery clicking into place. Fear had been my restraint. It had kept my authority tethered to humanity, to the awareness that killing is never trivial even when justified. Without it, my authority became something else, pure, immediate, unforgiving, and the regiment adjusted around that new shape as water adjusts around a stone. By the end of the week, my execution tally had doubled. My reports were praised by high command for restoring operational integrity. A commendation arrived stamped and countersigned, a piece of paper acknowledging the improved morale figures that my brutality had produced. I stared at that commendation for a long time. The words were neat, Official. Cold. They made no mention of faces, of blood, of the smell of fear in the ration line. They reduced everything to metrics and outcomes, as the Imperium always does, and I realized, with a chill deeper than the trench wind, that no one above me cared why I had become this way. Only that it worked. There was a time when the battlefield demanded my attention. I do not mean vigilance, that had always been constant, but presence. The need to be aware of my own body in relation to danger, to feel the incoming shells as threats rather than inconveniences. To move with purpose, choosing when to advance and when to shelter. Fear had been the mechanism that calibrated those choices, the invisible hand that kept instinct sharp. Without it, the battlefield flattened. I noticed the change during an advance across a shattered manufacturing district. The ground was a lattice of broken conveyors, collapsed gantries, and cooling slag pools that hissed when rain touched them. Enemy artillery fell in steady intervals, the impacts measured and methodical. Shrapnel sang through the air like swarms of metal insects. The kind of place where a man was supposed to keep his head down. I did not. I walked, not quickly, not dramatically, just forward, coat trailing behind me, boots clanging on steel plating. Shells landed close enough to shake my teeth, and I registered them the way one registers bad weather, annoying, but not actionable. Somewhere to my left, a squad dove for cover. To my right, a transport detonated, its crew vanishing in fire. I stepped around the crater and kept moving. The realization came slowly, and that made it worse. I was not testing fate. I was not daring death. I simply did not consider either relevant. The battlefield had become a space to be crossed, not a hazard to be navigated, like a corridor filled with noise and debris that someone eventually would have to walk through. The troops noticed. At first, they hesitated, torn between training and instinct. A commissar walking upright through fire creates a contradiction, and soldiers are trained to resolve contradictions by following authority. One by one, they rose from cover and followed me, not because I ordered them to, but because the shape of inevitability pulls things into alignment. We advanced faster than planned, casualties mounted. That was inevitable too. I noted them clinically, mentally adjusting numbers the way a quartermaster adjusts supply tallies. When a man fell, another filled the space. When a line thinned, I redirected a reserve without comment. The noise never stopped, but it lost its urgency. It became background, like the hum of machinery you stop noticing after enough exposure. A fragment caught me in the thigh midway through the push. I felt the impact. A sharp jolt, pressure, warmth spreading under my coat. My leg buckled for half a step. I adjusted my stride and continued. Pain registered, distant and manageable, like a data point rather than a warning. Behind me a medic shouted something. I raised a hand without looking back. Later, I said. The medic did not argue. By the time we reached the next firing line, my coat was stiff with drying blood. I issued orders, my voice steady, my mind already moving ahead to the next objective. Only when the guns fell silent in that sector did I allow myself to sit. A medic approached, pale-faced, hands shaking slightly as he cut away fabric and packed the wound. He worked quickly, glancing up at me as if expecting reprimand for the delay. "You should have sought cover, sir," he said, unable to stop himself. I looked down at him, not harshly, not angrily, just long enough for the words to wither. "Why?" I asked. He had no answer that mattered. Medica logs began to accumulate. They were not accusatory. The Imperium rarely accuses without cause. Instead, they were careful, neutral, phrased in the language of concern. Subject exhibits reduced threat response. Subject displays a typical pain tolerance. Subject behavior flagged as anomalous, but operationally effective. Operationally effective. Those words followed me, every time I walked the line under fire. Every time I denied evacuation for myself and others. Every time I treated incoming artillery as a scheduling inconvenience rather than a mortal threat. The battlefield was no longer chaos. It was process, orders in, compliance out. I began to feel like an administrator embedded in a war zone, ensuring workflow continuity under adverse conditions. The men joked about it, nervously. They said I walked like nothing could touch me. They said the enemy would run out of shells before I ran out of patience. I did not correct them. Ones became entries in a ledger. A slash across the ribs, patched and ignored. A concussion, monitored, dismissed. Shrapnel embedded near the shoulder, left in place because removal would take time. As long as I could stand and speak, I remained functional. That was the standard I applied to myself, and therefore to everyone else. Sleep became optional. I could go for days on stim, rations and sheer momentum, mind clear and focused. When exhaustion finally forced rest, it came suddenly and deeply, without dreams. I woke ready to resume, as if no interruption had occurred. War ceased to feel exceptional. This was perhaps the most dangerous change of all. When war is exceptional, it demands attention. It insists on being remembered. When it becomes routine, it slips into the background of thought, shaping behavior without ever being questioned. I found myself planning engagements the way one plans logistics: what resources would be consumed, what losses acceptable, what gains sufficient to justify continuation. There was no emotional component to these calculations, only efficiency. An officer once challenged me on this. A captain, old enough to remember campaigns before this one, scarred in ways that suggested survival through caution rather than aggression. He requested a private audience, voice tight with restrained concern. "You're pushing them too hard," he said. "Morale is holding, but at a cost. Men are breaking." I considered his words carefully, not because they troubled me, but because I wanted to be precise in my response. "Morale is a means," I said, "not an end. Compliance is the objective." He stared at me, searching for something familiar. "You don't even sound like you believe in it anymore," he said quietly. I looked at him for a long moment. "I believe in outcomes," I replied. He left soon after, reassigned, not by me, at least not directly, but my reports had a way of moving people along. High command prefers problems that do not question methodology. As days blurred together, I realized I could no longer recall the last time I had taken cover instinctively, or flinched, or hesitated. My body responded to threats with calculation rather than fear, moving only when movement served a purpose. The battlefield had become paperwork, forms filled in real time, stamped with blood and fire. Every engagement another file opened and closed. Every life another entry balanced against an objective. I was no longer reacting to war, I was administering it, and somewhere beneath that realization, I felt the faintest echo of something that might once have been concern, not fear, not guilt, but awareness that a line had been crossed. The Imperium does not train its commissars to feel nothing, it trains them to feel enough. I was operating beyond that threshold now, and no one seemed inclined to stop me. In fact, the more routine I made the battlefield, the more praise filtered down through the chain of command. Efficiency, stability, results. The war was no longer chaos demanding courage, it was paperwork demanding completion, and I was very good at completing it. I should have died in the manufacturum collapse. The structure had been unstable long before we entered it. Stress fractures in the load-bearing pillars, corrosion eating through the joints, centuries of neglect hidden beneath layers of sacred paint, and warning sigils no one bothered to read anymore. The enemy knew it too. They waited until we were inside, until the advance was committed, then brought the whole cathedral of industry down on us with charges placed deep in the sublevels. I remember the sound more than anything else, not the explosion itself, but the way the building screamed as it failed. Metal tearing free from metal, concrete slabs grinding past one another, the air forced out of collapsing spaces with a roar that crushed the lungs. The floor vanished beneath my feet. I felt myself falling, weightless for a heartbeat, then the world ended in pressure and darkness. There was pain, immense, crushing pain. But it arrived muted, as if filtered through layers of distance. I registered it the way I registered damage to equipment: severity high, function compromised, outcome uncertain. Then even that faded as debris buried me completely. I did not panic. That realization came later, when I had time to consider it. Buried alive beneath thousands of tons of ruin, air scarce, body pinned in ways no human frame should endure, and I felt irritation rather than fear. Irritation that the advance had been delayed, irritation that reports would need to be amended. Time passed, or perhaps it did not. It is difficult to measure such things when the world is reduced to darkness, pressure, and the faint rasp of your own breath echoing inside a crushed chest cavity. I waited to die not with resignation, With expectation, it seemed appropriate, statistically tidy. A commissar crushed while enforcing discipline in a collapsing war zone, tragic, but narratively sound. I imagined the report killed in action. Body unrecoverable. Effects logged and sealed. A clean ending. It did not come. Instead, there was movement, not mine. The debris shifted as extraction teams clawed their way down, guided by faint signals from my armor's locator beacon. I felt hands on me, gloved, mechanical, relentless. Pain flared as pressure lifted, as crushed limbs were freed in increments too small to count. Someone shouted my designation. Someone else laughed sharp and disbelieving. Still alive. A voice said, alive. The word felt wrong. They pulled me out in pieces, or so it felt. My body refused to cooperate, joints locked, muscles torn. Ribs fractured into things that no longer resembled ribs. Blood filled my mouth. My vision flickered in and out, the world appearing in broken frames, medica lights, dust, choked air, faces smeared with ash. I remember thinking, not consciously, but with a dull, persistent clarity, that this was becoming inconvenient. I should have died there. Everything about the situation suggested I had exceeded reasonable survival parameters. And yet, I did not feel myself slipping away. Consciousness clung stubbornly, refusing to dim, refusing to grant the mercy of blackout. In the Medica bunker, they worked on me in shifts. I know this because I overheard fragments of conversation drifting in and out of my awareness. Terms like structural integrity compromised, extensive trauma, miraculous stabilization. The tone was clinical, but threaded with something else, unease. One of them whispered, thinking I was unconscious. He shouldn't be awake. I wanted to tell them I agreed. They repaired what they could. Reinforced what they could not. Painkillers dulled the worst of it, but never fully. I refused sedation when offered. Not out of courage, out of practicality. There were orders to give, reports to amend, discipline to enforce. Within hours, perhaps a day, they had me upright again. I stood in the bunker, wrapped in bandages and braces, leaning heavily on a medic's shoulder while issuing instructions to regroup the companies affected by the collapse. My voice was hoarse, my breath shallow, but it carried. Men listened. They always did. The whispers started after that. At first, they were careful. Soldiers are adept at rumor, but they know when to keep it low. I heard them in passing, in the way conversations paused when I approached. Words like favored, cursed, untouchable. One man crossed himself when he thought I wasn't looking. I felt nothing about it. Shells landed near me later that week, close enough to shower us with rubble and shrapnel. I didn't flinch. A blast threw me off my feet. I stood back up with mechanical slowness, brushed debris from my coat, and continued issuing orders. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else stared as if at a ghost. Death had begun to refuse me, not dramatically, not with declarations or visions, simply by failing to arrive when summoned by circumstance. Each time it should have claimed me and did not. Another small piece of certainty eroded, not mine, but everyone else's. High Command noticed. A data packet arrived marked for review only, containing a summary of my statistical survivability anomalies. The language was cautious, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic neutrality. My continued existence was described as improbable, then quietly categorized as acceptable variance under prolonged combat exposure. Acceptable. I wondered how many times a man had to fail to die before he became a category instead of a person. The battlefield responded to me differently after that. Men took greater risks when I was nearby, as if proximity to my indifference insulated them. They followed me into fire they would once have hesitated to cross. Losses increased, but so did momentum. High Command approved the results and ignored the cost. I began to suspect that my survival was no longer accidental, not in a mystical sense. There were no voices, no visions, but in a systemic one. I was useful. My lack of fear, my refusal to die, my ability to keep functioning under conditions that broke others, these traits stabilized regiments in ways doctrine alone could not. The Imperium values nothing more than a solution that does not require understanding. I tested the theory once, without announcing it even to myself. During an assault across open ground under sustained heavy fire, I deliberately remained exposed. No cover, no evasive movement, just forward motion, coat snapping in the blast wind. The shells fell. The ground churned. Men died around me. I did not. I reached the objective with my boots intact and my body damaged but operational. As if the universe itself had grown tired of trying. That was when the suspicion took root, cold and heavy. Perhaps death no longer wanted me, or perhaps the Imperium did not. Either way, I was beginning to understand that something essential had changed. Fear had left me first. Now death itself seemed reluctant to finish the process. I stood on that broken ground, smoke curling around my legs, and felt only irritation that the advance had taken longer than planned. That, more than survival, was the true aberration. Mercy used to arrive disguised as procedure, a pause before sentence, a question asked aloud even when the answer was already known, a moment granted for prayer, confession, or last words, not because doctrine required it, but because fear insisted upon ritual. Fear demanded that I acknowledge the weight of what I was about to do. It slowed the hand just enough to remind the soul it was still attached. When fear left, mercy followed it out. I did not notice the absence at first. It revealed itself gradually, the way rot reveals itself in a structure long assumed sound. Small decisions changed tone. Requests that once earned consideration now registered as noise. Explanations became redundant. Men spoke to me as if speaking mattered, and I began to resent the time it took them to finish their sentences. The first time I denied last rites, I told myself it was situational. The platoon had broken during a counterattack, nothing dramatic, just a retreat that lasted too long and cost too much ground. I pulled the offender from the line myself, boots dragging him through ash and debris to a position where the others could see clearly. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with soot and blood that was not all his own. He was shaking, not uncontrollably, but enough to note. He asked for a priest. The request was not unreasonable. Doctrine allowed it. Tradition encouraged it. The creed is a tool, but it is also a comfort, and comfort has its uses in maintaining order. In the past I would have granted it 5 minutes, perhaps less, enough to preserve the fiction that faith softened the blow. I looked at him and felt only irritation. The artillery was resuming its schedule. Orders were backing up in my mind. The delay would serve no operational purpose. "Need," I said. He stared at me, confusion cutting through his fear. "Commissar, please." The word please echoed unpleasantly. I raised the pistol and executed him without further exchange. The act was clean, efficient, witnessed and logged. The body fell, and the line stiffened immediately. Discipline reasserted itself with mathematical precision. Later, when the chaplain confronted me, quietly, carefully, I cited operational urgency. "Delays compromise momentum," I said. "Momentum preserves order." He searched my face for something, doubt, perhaps, or anger, but found only calm. He nodded, recorded the denial in his own ledgers, and withdrew. The system accepted my justification without friction. That acceptance emboldened me. Mercy, I discovered, created inefficiencies at every level. Last words prolonged events. Explanations invited debate. Leniency encouraged interpretation. Fear of death had once made me cautious in its application. But without fear, death became simply another corrective measure, final, effective, administratively sound. Requests for clemency increased as the regiment adjusted to my new methods. Men came to me with excuses carefully rehearsed, testimonies from comrades, appeals framed in doctrinal language. They cited fatigue, miscommunication, equipment failure. I listened only long enough to identify the violation. Then I denied the request and proceeded. Each denial shortened the next appeal. Soon, men stopped asking. They began to present themselves in silence, shoulders squared, eyes forward, already resigned to outcome. That efficiency pleased the command staff. Fewer disruptions, faster resolutions, cleaner reports. I felt myself becoming something else, not cruel. Cruelty implies intent, emotion, enjoyment. I felt none of those. I was becoming functional. An extension of doctrine given legs and a voice. A moving seal of approval or termination. The paperwork reflected this shift before I fully acknowledged it. My reports grew shorter. Language tightened. Emotional descriptors vanished entirely. Where once I might have written execution carried out to preserve morale, I now wrote execution carried out. The implication was understood. Morale was a secondary consideration. Compliance was the metric that mattered. High command did not object. On the contrary, my evaluations improved. A commendation arrived noting my decisive enforcement posture, and exceptional maintenance of operational discipline under sustained stress. The language was bloodless, efficient, approving. I read it without reaction. The regiment changed around me. Men stopped looking at my face and began watching my hands instead. Conversations ceased when I entered a space, not out of fear of punishment, but out of recognition that speech no longer served a purpose. Orders flowed one way, compliance flowed back. The system achieved a kind of equilibrium. I noticed, distantly, that I had stopped learning new names, not out of disdain, out of irrelevance. Names are useful when you expect continuity, when relationships matter. Here, bodies rotated too quickly. Losses mounted and were replaced. Designations sufficed. I was called Sir less often. Instead, there was a careful neutrality in address, as if men feared that familiarity itself might be interpreted as wasteful. Even officers, men of rank and experience, kept interactions brief, professional, stripped of all but necessity. One captain challenged me again, weeks after the first had been reassigned. "We're winning," he said, voice low. "But they're afraid of you more than the enemy." I considered the statement carefully. "Fear is not a finite resource," I replied. "It is transferable." He frowned. "That's not what I meant." I looked at him. "It is what matters," I said. He did not press further. At night, I sometimes reviewed the execution logs, not out of guilt, out of habit. Each entry was precisely time, location, offense, sentence, witnesses. I could trace the regiment's progress through those pages the way one might trace a supply line on a map. Where discipline faltered, executions clustered. Where compliance solidified, they thinned. The data was clear. Mercy introduced variance. Variance introduced instability. Instability cost lives in bulk, rather than individually. This was the logic I found myself accepting without resistance. And yet, this is the confession part. I was aware of the hollowness growing inside me. Not regret, not sorrow, absence. Fear had once kept me human by forcing me to feel the weight of each decision. Without it, the weight dispersed, leaving behind a vast emptiness where judgment operated unopposed by conscience. I did not miss mercy. I simply noted that its absence had removed a layer of friction I had not known I was carrying. I was lighter. Like the bolt pistol had felt that first day, I began to suspect that this was not an accident, not a personal failing or aberration. The Imperium trains commissars to be instruments. Fear had been the last remnant of the man beneath the uniform, a flaw tolerated because it limited excess. Now that flaw was gone, and nothing in the system was designed to put it back. I was not becoming a monster. I was becoming exactly what the Imperium required when hesitation became too costly. Mercy had been classified, quietly, efficiently, as an inefficiency. And inefficiencies are removed. They stopped assigning me places with names. That was the first sign I noticed, though it took time to understand its significance. Orders arrived no longer referencing specific worlds or campaigns, but conditions regimental morale below acceptable threshold, command integrity compromised, discipline failure imminent. I was no longer being sent to fight wars. I was being deployed to correct deviations. I became a solution. The transfer orders were relentless, no rest periods, no ceremonial downtime. As soon as one front stabilized, casualty rates normalized, compliance metrics returned to acceptable variance, I was moved again. Another transport, another regiment. Another war that had already decided it was dying and needed something ruthless to keep it standing. I traveled through holds that smelled of oil, incense, and unwashed bodies. Through corridors lined with devotional plaques worn smooth by generations of hands that had passed through without being remembered. I stopped unpacking my kit. There was no point. The uniform followed me. The pistol followed me. The function followed me. Each new regiment reacted the same way. At first, suspicion. They had heard of me, sometimes in fragments, sometimes exaggerated. A commissar who did not flinch, who walked under fire, who executed without pause or ritual. Officers watched me carefully, measuring whether I would disrupt their authority or reinforce it. Then came the test. Every failing unit has one moment where weakness surfaces openly, a refusal, a delay, a request for leniency disguised as tactical concern. They waited to see how I would respond. I responded the same way every time, cleanly, publicly, without hesitation. The effect was immediate and repeatable. Discipline snapped into place like a tightened cable. Men stopped testing boundaries because there were none to test. Officers stopped hedging orders because consequences were no longer theoretical. The fear I inspired was not chaotic, it was predictable. And predictability in war is stability. High command noticed the pattern. Commendations arrived more frequently now, stacked with seals and countersigns, their language increasingly abstract. I was described as operationally indispensable, force multiplying, doctrinally aligned, no mention of cost, no mention of attrition beyond acceptable margins. I read these commendations the way one reads weather reports, useful, impersonal, irrelevant to feeling. I realized gradually that I was no longer being evaluated as an individual. I was being tracked as an asset, my movements plotted, my effects measured. Where I went, casualty curves stabilized. Where I stayed too long, losses increased, but morale held. The Imperium accepted the trade without hesitation. That was when it became clear they had no intention of letting me stop. A normal commissar burns out eventually. Fear erodes them, or guilt, or the simple accumulation of faces they cannot forget. They are reassigned to quieter posts, or promoted into administrative roles, or, if they fail, removed quietly. The system accounts for their limits. It did not account for mine, because I no longer appeared to have any. I was transferred from collapsing trench lines to shattered hive districts, from manufactorum uprisings to fortress world sieges where the garrison had forgotten why it still fought. Everywhere, the pattern repeated. I arrived, I enforced, I moved on. No one asked if I wished to remain. I did not ask either. There was an unspoken understanding between myself and the machinery of command. As long as I continued to function, as long as I produced results, the Imperium would keep feeding me into its worst failures. I was cheaper than reinforcement, faster than retraining, more reliable than inspiration. I was not meant to be replaced. I was meant to be used. I began to notice how carefully I was handled, never left in one place long enough to become mythologized beyond control, never allowed to build a personal following, never promoted into a position where my authority might expand beyond disciplinary enforcement. I remained a commissar, always attached, never autonomous. A blade is most useful when it stays sharp and unadorned. Medici reports continued to flag anomalies, survivability beyond expected thresholds, delayed response to trauma, reduced stress indicators. Each report ended the same way: no action recommended. The data was archived. The asset remained in circulation. Once, during transit, I reviewed my own personnel file. It was extensive, cross-referenced across multiple commands, campaigns, and theaters. Notes appended by officers I did not remember. Marginalia from analysts whose faces I would never see. Patterns highlighted, trends graphed. One line stood out. Subject exhibits no measurable degradation in performance under prolonged exposure to extreme combat stress. That line replaced my name in my thoughts. I was reassigned again before I could linger on it. The men I enforced began to look at me differently than previous regiments had. Not with fear alone, but with a kind of fatalistic trust. They believed, incorrectly, that if they followed me, they would survive. Not because I protected them, but because the war seemed to bend around my presence, reshaping itself into something survivable through sheer brutality. I did nothing to correct that belief. Belief, like fear, is a resource. I stopped receiving inquiries from chaplains, stopped being asked to attend sermons or morale rites. My presence was no longer spiritual, it was administrative. The creed still existed, but it was background noise, invoked when useful, ignored when not. Faith, I realized, had become optional in my vicinity. Orders arrived faster now, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradictory. I resolved them myself, choosing whichever produced faster stabilization. No one questioned my discretion. No one reviewed my decisions closely. The system trusted outcomes over methodology. That trust was absolute. It was also isolating, not emotionally. I had lost the capacity to feel loneliness, but structurally. I existed between units, between commands, belonging fully to none of them. Regiments remembered me as a phase they passed through, like heavy casualties or a particularly brutal campaign. Something endured, then survived. I left no legacy, only corrected behavior. At some point, there is no single moment, I realized that even if I wanted to stop, there was no mechanism for it, no form to file, No retirement protocol for a commissar who remained effective. No precedent for an asset that did not degrade. The Imperium does not reward durability with rest. It exploits it. I was no longer afraid of death. That much was clear, but something colder settled in its place. The understanding that as long as I continued to function, the Imperium would continue to find places for me. Endless wars. Endless failures to correct. Endless need for someone who would not hesitate, would not reflect, would not stop. I had become a permanent measure. A correction applied wherever the system began to fray, and permanence, I learned, is far more terrifying than mortality. Faith did not leave me all at once. It eroded the way stone erodes under dripping water, quietly, patiently, without spectacle. There was no moment of revelation, no crisis of belief, no defiant rejection of the creed. It simply stopped connecting to anything inside me. The words remained. The rituals remained. The symbols retained their sanctioned power. What vanished was the sense that any of it required me. I still recited the catechisms. I still stood through sermons delivered in bunkers that smelled of mildew, oil, and blood-soaked bandages. I still bowed my head when required, lips moving in time with the prescribed litanies. From the outside, nothing had changed. A commissar who abandoned the forms would be corrected immediately, but inside, the prayers sounded like static, not offensive, not false, just redundant. The creed had once provided context, an explanation for suffering, a structure that made death meaningful rather than wasteful. Now death was already accounted for, already processed, already absorbed into the system. Faith offered nothing that procedure did not. I began to notice how often I spoke judgment without referencing doctrine at all. There was a time when every execution was framed within the creed, the sentence delivered as an extension of divine will filtered through imperial law. Now I cited violations, metrics, outcomes, cowardice, dereliction, inefficiency. The words came easily, unadorned by theology. No one objected. The troops did not ask for sermons anymore. They did not seek absolution before battle. They looked to me not as a moral anchor, but as a fixed point, something immovable, inevitable. My presence did not inspire them. It contained them. I remember executing a man for exhaustion, not cowardice, not disobedience. Exhaustion. He had advanced as ordered, held position under fire, returned when recalled. He had done everything required of him until his body failed. When ordered forward again, he simply sat down in the mud and stared at nothing. His rifle lay across his knees. His hands shook. The officer brought him to me reluctantly, already rehearsing an argument for leniency, medical evaluation. The officer began. I raised a hand. The man did not beg. That was what unsettled me. He looked up at me with dull eyes and said, very calmly, "I can't anymore." There was no fear in his voice, just honesty. That should have mattered. Once, it would have. Once, fear would have translated his words into something dangerous, a crack in morale, a reminder that even loyalty has limits. I would have felt the tension, the internal pull between punishment and preservation. Instead, I felt only the arithmetic. One exhausted man, if spared, becomes permission. Permission spreads, exhaustion follows, collapse comes next. I executed him where he sat. The officer said nothing. The squad stiffened, then moved on without comment. The system corrected itself. Momentum preserved. That night, a chaplain tried to speak with me. He was younger than the others had been, earnest in a way that suggested he still believed belief itself mattered. He approached carefully, as if proximity might be dangerous. "You don't even invoke the creed anymore," he said, not accusing, observing. "It is implicit." I replied. He frowned. "The men need to know why they suffer." I considered that. "They suffer because they are required to," I said. His shoulders sagged. "That's not faith." "No," I agreed. "It is function." He left shortly after, transferred, I heard later, to a quieter sector where morale issues were still treated with words before bullets. I did not miss him. The executions continued. Traitors, cowards, deserters, looters, insubordinate officers, exhausted soldiers who became liabilities by virtue of being human. I did not distinguish between them emotionally. The charge determined the outcome. The outcome followed procedure. My voice never wavered. My hand never shook. I began to notice that the troops no longer met my eyes, not out of guilt or fear alone, but because eye contact implies recognition. They no longer saw me as someone who judged them. I was the judgment itself, given shape and uniform. I did not correct this perception. Why would I? Correction implies preference. Preference implies belief. Belief requires investment. I had none left. In rare moments of stillness, short, carefully scheduled intervals between deployments, I would review archived sermons, doctrine files, old training materials from my induction. I recognized the words. I understood their intended effect. I simply could not feel them. Faith requires a soul to grip. I had become something else. The Imperium did not notice the loss, or perhaps it did and deemed it acceptable. After all, the creed exists to bind humanity together, to give meaning where none is evident. I was no longer human in the way that required binding. I functioned perfectly well without meaning. That realization settled over me like dust in an abandoned chapel. I was not angry about it. Anger would have been something. I was not sad. Sadness would have implied regret. What I felt was a vast neutrality, an internal silence that matched the way I now moved through war. Judgment without soul is efficient. It does not hesitate. It does not rationalize. It does not seek forgiveness afterward. It applies rules until the environment stabilizes or collapses entirely. The troops had adapted to that reality. They no longer whispered prayers before battle. They checked weapons. They waited for orders. They moved when told. When they failed, they did not plead. They accepted outcomes with a quiet resignation that bordered on relief. At least it was clear. I wondered, once, whether the creed had failed me, or whether I had simply outgrown its utility. The thought passed quickly. Assigning blame serves no purpose when results remain acceptable. I was still standing, still enforcing, still being moved from front to front like a corrective tool. Faith had lost meaning. So had death. And in that emptiness, I realized something far more unsettling than fear or doubt. There was nothing left inside me that could resist what came next. Judgment no longer passed through belief, conscience or soul. It passed through me directly. Wars ended around me. That was the strangest part, not that they ended, but that I remained when they did. Units were stood down, banners were folded, casualty lists finalized and archived. Officers were reassigned or retired. Chaplains moved on to shepherd the survivors toward whatever counted as peace in the Imperium's vocabulary. And I stayed, not in one place, not with one regiment, but present, a constant annotation in the margins of campaign histories. Where others became names etched into memorial plates or lines in casualty tallies, I became a reference point. A footnote that appeared again and again across different theaters, unchanged except for additional seals and countersigns. I watched roll calls conclude without me. Rows of men stood at attention while names were read aloud. Those who would continue. Those who would be transferred. Those who would be remembered. Silence followed each name that would never answer again. It was a ritual meant to give closure. My name was never read, not because I was forgotten, but because I was already accounted for elsewhere, always elsewhere, already en route, already assigned, already required. I stopped unpacking entirely after that. There was no reason to arrange personal effects when no location was ever permanent. My quarters were temporary spaces that smelled of someone else's sweat and incense, walls scuffed by previous occupants who had already moved on or died. I slept where instructed, woke when ordered, and boarded the next transport without ceremony. The Imperium did not ask whether I wished to rest. Why would it? I had become something that did not fatigue in the way others did. My body bore damage, yes, layers of scar tissue, reinforcement, lingering pain that never quite faded, but it did not fail. Medicare assessments grew increasingly terse, subject functional, no intervention required, return to duty approved, always approved. I noticed that newer officers sometimes stared at me as if I were an artifact rather than a man. They checked my service record more than once, brows furrowing as dates stretched beyond what felt reasonable. Some asked careful questions, framed as curiosity rather than concern. How long have you been in the field, Commissar? I answered truthfully. Their reactions varied. Disbelief, unease, forced professionalism, but none pursued the matter. Records, after all, are more reliable than intuition. If the file said I belonged here, then I did. Death no longer pursued me. I do not mean that in a mystical sense. There were no near misses that felt miraculous anymore, no moments of dramatic survival. Death simply failed to arrive. Bullets struck elsewhere. Collapses spared me by margins too narrow to justify. Diseases passed through camps and bypassed my quarters. When injuries accumulated, they stabilized rather than worsened. It was as if the concept of my ending had been misplaced. I realized, eventually, that fear had been the last tether tying me to mortality. Fear makes death relevant. It frames life as something that can be lost. Without it, death became merely another outcome that might or might not occur. And if it did not occur, there was no reason to dwell on its absence. My name persisted in records long after others faded. I saw it myself once, while reviewing a campaign archive during transit. A long list of disciplinary officers assigned over decades, most serving brief, brutal tenures before being replaced. My designation appeared repeatedly, sometimes years apart, always attached to phrases like stabilization achieved or command integrity restored. I was not praised, I was retained. That distinction matters. Praise implies admiration. Retention implies utility. The Imperium retains tools, not heroes. Heroes are inspirational but fragile. Tools are durable, predictable, and replaceable, except when they aren't. I was not replaceable anymore. Not because I was unique, but because the system had shaped itself around my continued function. Units adjusted faster under my presence. Command chains relied on my enforcement to compensate for structural weaknesses. Removing me would require compensatory reforms, retraining, resource allocation. The Imperium avoids inefficiency, so I continued, through new wars that felt identical to old ones. Through different uniforms that changed nothing about behavior. Through shifting doctrines that never altered the core truth humanity survives, by grinding itself down into compliance and calling the remainder victory. I enforced that truth without emotion. I executed men who reminded me, faintly, of who I might once have been. I denied mercy to officers who still believed belief mattered. I watched cities fall, worlds burn, populations reduced to numbers that fit neatly into reports. And I felt nothing about it, not pride, not sorrow, not even satisfaction, just continuity. Sometimes, rarely, I wondered what would happen if I stopped, not deserted, not rebelled, simply stopped issuing orders, stopped enforcing, stood aside and let hesitation return, let mercy reintroduce variance into the system. The thought never progressed far. There was no mechanism for it, no internal lever to pull. I had been hollowed too thoroughly, optimized too completely. Even imagining refusal felt abstract, like imagining a machine choosing not to operate. Machines do not choose. They function until they are dismantled or until the system no longer requires them. I began to suspect that my true fate was not immortality, but indefinite postponement. As long as I remained useful, death would be delayed. When usefulness ended, I would be removed as quietly as any other obsolete asset. That prospect did not trouble me. Trouble requires attachment, so this is my confession, recorded not for absolution but for accuracy. When a commissar stops fearing death, he does not become brave. He does not become cruel. He does not become enlightened or damned. He becomes permanent, a standing order given flesh, a corrective measure that walks, speaks, and fires a pistol with flawless efficiency. A name that persists in archives long after meaning has drained from it. I am still standing at the end of the roll call. And until the Imperium decides otherwise, I will remain so unchanging, unafraid, and endlessly required.